why is this the attitude? I mean, you got to look at the sort of incentive structures and that socialization, the sort of PMC white guilt is a big thing because when you have people who are in a certain level of privilege, they feel guilt, and the way to get rid of that guilt without thinking too hard is do this sort of posing as politics, as Adolf Reed brilliantly described it. You get this like performative politics. And it's not just white guilt. I should say it's just like PMC guilt because I would have seen actually just as common is people who are like, for example, part black or in part indigenous in Canada, very common, and they're PMC themselves, and they feel the need to they feel that they were way more privileged than their ancestors were, and that they need to make up for this privilege by making, the white people pay for the crimes they did to their ancestors.
This is a good point. I think it's affluent people guilt. It's people who seem to have been successful guilt. It's guilt that people who have made it in this system feel because they know on some level that this system is not great and could certainly be a heck of a lot better. And they have not devoted their lives to changing the system or to making it dramatically better. They have not. They have found a way to fit into it and to do well. And then they think by flagellating themselves and then making pithy gestures that they can make up for the fact that they're not contributing to changing the system or making it a better world.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with one of my favorite regular guests and a fan favorite guest now, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD from Cambridge, author of 2 great books, both of which we've discussed on this channel, such as The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. I'm happy to announce that Benjamin and I will be doing a bi-monthly show of sorts. We almost were already doing that, given how many times you've been on the show. So we figured might as well, make this a thing. For now, we're doing it once a month and, first half on the public, second half on Patreon and the Backroom, which if you're not part of already, you're missing out seriously. And given the fact that the price hasn't gone up with inflation, it's well worth it.
Yeah, there's a discount effectively.
Mm-hmm. And sort of what we'll be doing is covering stuff that involves current events, but using that to go into broader, deeper questions that I think are fundamentally, and if not timeless, political questions that are very important regardless of the particular context. And what I always appreciate about you is you have an analysis of these things that you look about it, think about it before, and then come talk about it. And today, we're going to first talk about Trump's Gaza plan, what is happening with the ceasefire, and the Middle East more broadly when it comes to this conflict. And we're going to talk about the rise of the Reform Party in the UK, Nigel Farage, and in the back room, talk about the broader topic of immigration, which has been a topic I've been wanting to discuss in a lot of depth and with some nuance for a while now. Benjamin, what do you think would be important to get to first with regard to the Gaza plan? Maybe first listeners should maybe have an idea as to what is happening at the current moment.
Yeah, and in particular, a lot of the media that covers the Gaza thing is about who's bad, and let's make sure that we all know who is bad and who's doing the bad stuff. The negotiations are an attempt to stop the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza. They're an attempt to stop it that includes the United States, the Gulf states, the states that are immediate neighbors of Israel, so Egypt and Jordan. Then you've also got the European states who are also concerned about this, in part because they have suffered under disruption to Red Sea shipping as a consequence of the Houthi rebel attacks on the ships going through the Red Sea. There's a lot of different stakeholders involved. The impasse is that all of these states, while they would like Israel to withdraw, are not willing to fight Israel or to take actions that would fundamentally endanger the survival of the Israeli state to make that happen. So if you're not willing to directly confront the Israeli state to get Israel to withdraw from Gaza, how do you persuade Israel to withdraw from Gaza? If you're going to persuade Israel, then you have to take into account Israel's point of view, its interests, its self-understanding, the way that it understands the situation, and make some kind of offer to Israel that might potentially induce Israel to withdraw. So the offer that has been made is an offer to put into place a security arrangement in Gaza that will not be Hamas, but also will not be Israel. So the Israeli concern is if Israel withdraws, that Hamas will be reestablished in Gaza, and that therefore Gaza will continue to be a potential source of trouble for Israel in the future. The way to avoid that is to get some other kind of security arrangement going in Gaza that's not Hamas, that Israel can withdraw in light of. But the challenge there is now appetite to have Western troops, American troops, or European troops deployed in Gaza. Nobody really wants to see that happen. The public in the West doesn't want that to happen. Israel doesn't want it to happen. The Palestinians don't want it to happen. And the Arab states don't want it to happen. So you therefore need some other kind of security force. It can't be Hamas. The Palestinian Authority is not currently organized in such a way that it can effectively take over operations in Gaza by itself. At the very least, it's not believed that it can do that. It's not trusted to do that. So you therefore need involvement from outside parties that are not the Europeans or the Americans, at least not at the level of the troops. And that means that you're going to need Palestinian troops trained by other Arab states, not the PA, and funded by other Arab states, not the PA. And it took a long time to put together funding and training, and then also to come to some sort of agreement about who would lead the interim arrangement. And the name that was announced is Tony Blair, which strikes people as ridiculous for understandable reasons. Tony Blair, since exiting as Prime Minister of the UK, has been heavily involved in trying to intervene in the Middle East at a diplomatic level to try to shape the outcome of events there. I think Tony Blair knows that he will be associated with the Middle East because of his participation in the Iraq War. And by trying to make things happen that he thinks are positive in the Middle East, Tony Blair is attempting to resuscitate his legacy as prime minister. If there are positive developments in the Middle East in the direction of liberalism or democracy subsequent to the Iraq War, and Tony Blair can tie himself to that development, then his involvement in the Iraq War ceases to be this black mark on him. And I think this has driven him, along with a certain amount of religious zeal that he has in still maintaining that old 2000s belief that if you spread liberalism and you spread democracy to more countries, that this will produce transformation in standard of living, transformation in human rights, and so on and so forth. Tony Blair remains kind of religiously committed to this project and has been ever since leaving office. So they've talked about having him lead it or play a substantial role among other leaders in leading it. But the troops will be Palestinians trained by Egypt and Jordan, funded by the Gulf states. That seems to be the framework. And Hamas has expressed some reservations about some of the details of this, wants to be involved in negotiating some of it. But the Trump administration thinks that Hamas's willingness to negotiate some of those details is sufficient to move ahead with an exchange of hostages for prisoners and a ceasefire. And that seems to be what is now setting in. But it remains to be seen if ultimately Hamas will go through with turning over power in Gaza to this interim government.
So maybe a recap for the listeners, those who remember, it seems like it was a long time ago, but it really wasn't. When Trump proposed that like Mara Gaza thing, which they wanted to basically like clear everyone out and then turn Gaza into this metropolis and reindustrialize it, but largely for the sake of Israeli interests in in a way that it would be attractive to American investors. But this was totally rejected by Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states, not to mention the Palestinians. And even the
Yes.
international community was very skeptical. I mean, Egypt's been totally so cooperative with the United States to a point where it's it's not a friend to the Palestinians. And they even said that they would break their treaty with Israel if this
Yes.
was to go through, which is a pretty
The
big deal.
Egyptians have refused to participate in ethnic cleansing in the sense that they've refused to absorb a displaced population into Egypt. That's been one
Mhm.
of the hard lines for the Egyptians throughout the process. And I want to give the Egyptians some credit there. The fact that they have refused to do that prevented what might have otherwise seemed to many other states to be an easy way of trying to solve the problem. If you
Right.
can just make this an Egyptian problem and shunt large numbers of Palestinians out of Gaza and into Egypt. Egypt built a concentration camp as a contingency plan in the event that this happened, that there was a rush on the border, and Egypt had to absorb that. But nonetheless, in diplomatic talks, Egypt was very firm about not being willing to do that, at the very least, not being willing to do it without very, very heavy compensation. And
Mhm.
that compensation never materialized. So Egypt is not going to do that. Yes, it's also very significant that the plan calls for the Gazans to stay in Gaza. It does not have some ethnic cleansing or population displacement or population exchange component. There's no refugee resettlement program involved. Nothing like that is in the current proposal that they seem to be attempting to move forward with.
Which is a huge difference,
Yes.
massive difference. I mean, it was also crazy that what were they thinking with the previous proposal? I mean, I remember that AI generated video trying to promote that with the AI generated video of like Gaza in the future if it was all built up with this investment, and it was so spooky and weird and dystopian and distasteful. Even the MAGA base was super against it, and
Yeah.
MAGA
Much of
base.
that may happen, but it will happen if it does with Gulf state money, and it will happen with Gazans in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And that was left vague. It was not clear in the Trump administration's Mara Gaza proposal whether the Gazans would remain in Gaza or whether they would be displaced. They seemed to not be very clear about that. And that was a big diplomatic mistake. Just to not make it clear what their position was on that invited interpretations that were very critical. It's also worth stating that Anthony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, has publicly taken credit for this. He has suggested that this deal is based on the Biden era negotiations that the Biden administration had put together. So rather than this be a new plan cooked up by Rubio and Trump and Tony Blair, it is a return to the plan that, according to Blinken, was left in the drawer for the new administration that the Biden administration had worked on.
This current plan that is the most recently
Yes.
updated one.
Yeah.
And Israel, whether Israel is going to stick to this, seems very ambiguous because there was a ceasefire, right? Then Israel still bombed Gaza a few days after.
Yeah, Netanyahu adopted a very insidious strategy with respect to this plan. There was a version of this plan that was on the table and was to be taken to Hamas. Netanyahu insisted that additional things be inserted into it that would be unattractive to Hamas, specifically talking about Hamas's future role and it being very minimal, if not non-existent. Netanyahu believed that this would cause Hamas to reject the plan. And then he would, of course, not be bound by its terms.
Mm.
But the Gulf states were able to impress upon Hamas that if they accepted the plan, even if perhaps subsequently there would be other things that would take place in the further negotiations, that this would put enormous pressure on Netanyahu to go along with its terms. And that's what Hamas did. So, of course, Netanyahu tried to say on the phone to Trump when this immediately happened that he doesn't believe that Hamas will ultimately abide by the terms and that what Hamas has said should be taken to be a rejection of the deal as opposed to an acceptance of it. Trump, in response, said, the quote that he's Netanyahu, why are you so bleeping negative?
Yeah, or he said Netanyahu was trying to fuck me or whatever. Like,
Yeah, why are you
I
so
can bleep
fucking
that.
negative? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then on the basis of that, said, no, he is going to count this as an acceptance of the terms, and he's going to expect Netanyahu to abide by his end of the deal. And if there's further negotiation to take place with phase two, they'll do that. He's enthusiastic that that can be accomplished. And that enthusiasm that Trump has for that would also be shared by the Biden administration people and also by many European leaders, all of whom do think that this can potentially work. This is the framework that many states believed would work or was likely to work during the Biden administration. And I think one of the things that's difficult for the left is that the left really didn't follow these negotiations, which have been taking place for a long time, and instead mostly followed the war violence and followed quotes by particular military leaders or politicians that were very bellicose or involved language which suggested intent to do ethnic cleansing or genocide. And because the focus was on that, there was a lack of focus on the negotiations. And so I think a general lack of awareness of their contents and an assumption that many people had that they were not serious or that the people involved were just running cover for Israel by engaging in this diplomatic process.
Yeah,
I
good
think
cop,
a
bad
lot of this
cop.
was just not taken seriously when it should have been.
Yeah, it was seen that way because I mean, the Israeli officials have been the more clear about the intent towards ethnic cleansing, but the Biden administration's attempt to de-escalate this seemed very fickle and fickle to the point of insincerity, right? To the point where it's like, are they scared to really hold Netanyahu account, or are they unable to hold him to account, or are they being dishonest about their intent to actually negotiate an end to the war? Because Kamala Harris campaigned right on going for a ceasefire. She was perceived to be insincere, and frankly, their track record does make it hard to really ultimately, like, it does lower their credibility to a large extent, given the fact that they didn't seem very eager to pressure Netanyahu and the Israeli state more broadly in a really serious way, like threatening to actually not, to cut off arms sales, for example, or, using any sort of leverage the Americans have, which they have plenty.
Yeah, the way that they pressured him was by not facilitating the ethnic cleansing. So I think it's clear that at the very least, many senior Israeli officials were interested in ethnically cleansing Gaza. And of course, in international law, ethnic cleansing is tied to genocide. So a desire to ethnically cleanse a territory can be called genocide in international law. And there are certainly many Israeli officials who expressed a desire to ethnically cleanse the territory. The issue is that to ethnically cleanse the territory without simply killing the population, you need other countries to cooperate in taking the population. And what the other states did is they categorically refused to do that. They refused to take the population. The Israelis replied by saying, see, nobody even wants the Gazans. That was their propagandistic reply. But in point of fact, as long as no other country takes the Gazans, the only way that Israel could get rid of the Gazans would be by deploying a level of force which would ultimately be devastating to Israel in terms of its international reputation. And so this compels Israel to negotiate because Israel isn't prepared to kill the population. and it isn't able to get other countries to assist in the ethnic cleansing, it then gets into a stuck situation where it's stuck occupying territory with an escalating humanitarian crisis, which has increasingly negative effects on international perception. And so it's in Israel's own interest, since it's not prepared to kill the population and can't do that without extraordinary consequences ultimately. It's in Israel's interest to find a way to climb down and get out of this, even though many in the Israeli state would like it to be the case that Israel can get other states to facilitate an ethnic cleansing. That's not something that the other states have been willing to do at the level of taking the population. But yes, some people have called for these states to have a more confrontational attitude to Israel directly and to put the existence of the Israeli state into question. But that's not something that any of the states in the region have really been looking to do. If you look at not just the Europeans and the Americans, but the Arab states, none of the Arab states have been looking to use this as an opportunity to threaten the existence of Israel as a state. The only state in the region that would plausibly look at this as an opportunity to do that would be Iran.
Yeah. I mean, even Pakistan doesn't seem to really want, no Israeli state either, despite their rhetoric. You have a lot of confusion with the rhetoric. I mean, China's been condemning what Israel is doing. Meanwhile, it's its second biggest trade partner. It's very easy to forget that, when it comes to action and talk, a lot of these governments are full of shit in that it's easy to look only at the United States. But ultimately, who has really, you know, picked up the mantle for Gaza? At most, we have states who are against the genocide, but not really willing to endanger their own interests to stop it. And it seems that in this timeline between negotiations, Israel has been trying to really kill off about as many Gazans as they possibly can before they are forced into a negotiation. And they've, at this point, from the latest figures I've seen, it was 75% of the people dead are women and children. That's pretty significant. And it's to a point where the UN has seemed to have a consensus that is critical of Israel that is greater than it ever was in history, because it is undeniable. Also, the UN had suffered a bunch of casualties of their own through journalists and aid workers being bombed by Israel. So it's really at a point where it's just kind of undeniable. And there have been negotiations, but it seems like Israel's done just about anything to delay it, like in Qatar, when they bombed Qatar to stop the negotiations between Hamas and Israel, facilitated by the Qataris. So, given their unwillingness, right, is it possible that we might see Israel try to full on just go rogue, even despite the United States' wishes to end this conflict?
Well, I think that if Israel were to resume the conflict, it would need it to appear to be the case that Hamas was not abiding by the terms of the deal.
Right, like they did the
Because,
previous times with the Palestinians in negotiations.
right. So their goal would be to get Hamas to do something which would then legitimate their defection from the terms. That would be their objective. Similar to trying to insert poison pills into the deal so as to get Hamas to not accept it. The strategy is to get Hamas to do something which will confirm in the eyes of international partners the Israeli narrative with regard to Hamas, that Hamas is a terrorist organization that you fundamentally cannot negotiate with, and that the only thing that you can do with Hamas is destroy it. I don't think Israel believes that if Hamas is around, that this international force will be able to get rid of Hamas if Hamas is not dealt with or cooperating prior to the formation of that international force. I think the Israelis believe that if they don't get rid of Hamas, no one else ultimately will. Hamas, if Hamas genuinely disarms, stands down, takes the deal to be transported to other countries, the only people, by the way, who are in position to potentially be transported would be high-ranking members of Hamas who would otherwise be concerned about their safety or well-being in a post-Hamas Gaza. Those people would potentially go into exile in, for instance, the Gulf states. That the question is whether that will actually happen. Will Hamas actually take those steps and do those things? And Israel doesn't believe that Hamas will do those things. So if Israel doesn't believe that Hamas will do those things, then the question is, can Israel convince the other states that that is in fact the case, that Hamas won't do those things? And Hamas's goal is to act as if they're more reasonable than Israel says and are more willing to negotiate than Israel suggests. So it's a little bit of a case of the two sides are each trying to portray the other as unreasonable and mad. But this is often the case when you're dealing with an international mediator. Your goal is to get the mediator to think that the other side is crazy. Because if that's the case, then the mediator will give you more room to do whatever you feel is necessary about the other side. And you'll often see this happen even in little tiny fights among people. If two kids are siblings are fighting with each other and the parent shows up and goes, "What's going on?" He started it, he's crazy, is the narrative that you use to try to get the parent to give you more room to do what you felt was necessary given the behavior of him. This also happens when you get large numbers of states together trying to mediate. The two states that are the belligerents, or the two parties that are the belligerents in this case, because Hamas is not a state, and Gaza hardly could be considered to be a state in terms of its power and size and population. It's all much lower, wealth, all much lower than Israel. There is an attempt to portray the other side as unreasonable and fundamentally unwilling to negotiate. But I don't think that they can just go rogue on their own. The other states in the region, part of why they care is that they want to keep that trade open in the Red Sea. They want to keep the Suez Canal pumping. They want to keep trade in the Indian Ocean and around the Horn of Africa going strong. This is the kind of vulnerable point in the international trade system in recent years. The Horn of Africa, the political instability in Somalia and Yemen poses a significant threat to trade. This is particularly important for Europe. It's of much less importance to the United States because the percentage of Red Sea or Suez goods that end up going to the United States or coming from the United States is very small. Mostly this is a trade route between Europe and Asia that happens to pass through the Middle East and Africa on the way. But there's enormous concern about keeping all of that open, keeping all of that flowing. The states in the region don't want this to escalate. They don't want a large refugee crisis. They don't want large numbers of people that have to be absorbed. They have lots of interests in keeping this small, keeping it manageable, and preventing any kind of major breakdown in order that would result in hundreds of thousands of people leaving Gaza. So the states have an interest in preventing the ethnic cleansing from taking place because they're the ones who would have to absorb the populations. And that, just from the point of view of an immigration or refugee management issue, is a significant, expensive, difficult problem. And then you also have the internal politics of it's a large number of people coming all at once from a Middle Eastern country. How will the local population in, say, Italy or France or Germany or Egypt, how would the population respond to that? Can the government actually manage? A country like Egypt is in an economic crisis, is really suffering materially in recent years. Can they even manage to take care of several 100,000 people who come across the border in a short span of time without this putting serious physical pressure on the state? There's a lot of interest in getting this to stop, a lot of interest in it. And it's not something that comes principally from the left or from Western society. It's states that are concerned often about the right and how the right would respond to immigration and refugees.
Yeah, and then we saw with the Syrian refugee crisis, the reaction to that was quite negative, and especially given that, ultimately due to a lot of countries really had no part in causing the refugee crisis, having to absorb the costs from it. And that's like the biggest thing. I mean, if you're against mass migration and with refugees, it is harder for refugees usually to integrate compared to people who integrate, who apply to be immigrants on a voluntary legal basis, right? And you should be against these foreign wars and regime changes like the Syrian civil war, largely helped facilitated by the Israelis and the Americans and the Turkish, really created a crisis that just caused the country to be uninhabitable. And as we're seeing, we have the Zionist state ultimately trying to displacing people. That who's gonna absorb that costs? It's Europe. And before, there might have not been an immediate, clear reason for governments to not want that, because there's of course a lot of economic pros for refugees. They're exploitable labor. They could fill labor shortages. There's they're like they're economic units for capital. But for when you have a rise of the far right, I mean, that's a reason not to do that, right?
Yeah. The
And
politics were really different in 2014.
oh yeah,
No, we're now at a stage where all of these governments are acutely aware that if they take a large number of refugees from a Middle Eastern country, it's going to cause them domestic problems. It's going to cause them electoral problems. It's going to lead to issues with managing the right. This is something that is a concern for a lot of countries, and not just in Europe. It's also a concern for countries in the Middle East.
oh yeah. Well, the Middle East had to suffer from that refugee crisis way before. I mean, way before there ever was a Syrian refugee crisis. It was Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan who were absorbing most of the refugees from conquered Palestinian territory in Gaza. There was some of the first refugee camps were in Lebanon, and in Lebanon there was a reaction way back before against like not in a violent way or anything, but a very public dissatisfaction with the amount of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And if you think people of Levantine, other fellow Levantines get angry by excessive refugees. Imagine what Europeans are going to think of
Yeah.
excessive refugees. It's not easy for these things to just happen. So it's at a point where even the Macron right is very very eager to recognize a Palestinian state, because he has the far right that is always breathing under his neck. Very really ultimately he was supposed to win the last election if it wasn't for that Popular Front, and I think probably will win the next election. Frankly, it's only a matter of time. But yeah, it's can they contain this? Can the European Union broadly? That's another big thing. Contain this conflict without having a far right start opposing the European Union? Because right now the far right have been willing to work with the EU. Maloney has been working with the EU. Poland, they were able to kind of close borders and reduce refugees without secession. But if it gets to a point where states you have governments that want to do that, that's very dangerous for Europe.
Yeah. And in addition to that, you've got countries like Turkey or Egypt, when they do get a significant number of refugees from other places, are sometimes able to get the Europeans to pay money for them to prevent those people from migrating further on. But the amount of money that the Europeans are willing to pay the Libyans, the Tunisians, the Egyptians, the Turks is not very sizable, especially when you consider the number of people who live in these countries and the size of the economies. The amount that the Europeans are willing to pay is really quite poor. But the desperation of the Europeans at this point is quite high. There was just recently a case in which a European EU delegation went to speak with General Haftar, who is running a regime in eastern Libya in Cyrenaica that has not been recognized by the European Union. Nevertheless, they went to negotiate with him because a substantial number of people are migrating from eastern Libya, and they want to get Haftar to help them control this migration. And so even though they don't recognize him, they want to negotiate with him. And so when they arrived, he tried to get photos taken of them with his emissaries and perhaps even with himself to try to lend legitimacy to his regime. And they avoided these photos and hid in the airplane and ran from the cameras. And it was a huge mess. It was incredibly embarrassing for the EU diplomatic team. But I think it's indicative of the degree to which the Europeans at this point, even governments that we might think of as centrist or center left in some cases, are concerned about refugees, are concerned about large numbers of people from any Middle Eastern region being on the move. It really has become something that is very important to every European political party to find a way to manage. And then especially given that EU growth rates have been very poor since COVID and since the Ukraine war, you're talking about almost no economic growth. So it's very difficult. The costs are very difficult. They've made a commitment to spend 5% of GDP to meet a NATO defense requirement now, these countries. And so these are countries that aren't growing, and they have to increase their defense spending by percentage points of GDP. Where are they supposed to find this money? It's really difficult for them. Even Germany now is having a crisis with respect to its pensions. You can read the German press. It's really getting very serious in Europe, the level of economic distress that the European countries are in, and the consequences that this has had for their social services, their public services. You've got on top of this, the conflict between Israel and Hamas generates anti-Semitism too. And that anti-Semitism that it kicks up is also useful to the European right, ultimately. So there's a lot of reasons for these states to want to get this to end, a lot of reasons, and to not want Israel to ultimately succeed in displacing the population. But the question is how to do that in a way which ends the conflict rather than escalating it or deepening it. And generally, these states have acquiesced in having a state like Israel exist in this region, in part because the existence of Israel disrupts the formation of other larger states in the region. So the function of Israel in terms of Middle Eastern politics historically is that Israel sits in the way of the creation of something like a united Arab republic. In the post-colonial period, a lot of Arab post-colonial thinkers thought that the thing to do was to create a new large Arab state that would have some size, that would have some heft to it, and would be able, therefore, to have more leverage on the international stage. Egypt attempted to spearhead that project and create a united Arab republic together with Syria, and then at another point together with Libya, together with Gaddafi. They were not able to do that because Israel territorially sat in the way. And so when they had political instability within the United Arab Republic and Syria attempted to break away from Egypt, it was not possible for Egypt to drive tanks into Syria because Israel physically, territorially was in the way of their doing that. All they could do was try to fly some people over. And by the time they did that, the military coup was already over with and Syria was already de facto independent. So it's a very critical location, the Levant. It is the thing which ultimately, it's the area of the Middle East that is ultimately the block for the formation of a large state would be based either in Egypt or Turkey or Persia. All of those states, if they'd like to dominate the region, would have to move into the Levant or come across the Levant or operate in the Levant. And Israel's presence makes it very difficult for any of those states to do that. So it creates a division in the region, and then that division keeps all of the particular states in the region from becoming very powerful or very strong. And that leaves all of those states in a position where if the Europeans offer them small amounts of economic or development aid to prevent refugees from coming, they have to accept this because it's the best terms they can get.
That point about why European states support an Israeli state despite all the problems Israel clearly causes, is really important because originally, let's remember, it was the Soviets who were the biggest backers of Israel, even though it was ultimately England who paved the way for Israel's creation and existence. It was the Soviet Union who was the biggest backer of arming Israel initially. And France originally was quite skeptical, then very quickly moved to support Israel after the Suez Crisis. They became Israel's biggest supporter after that. And America, huge supporter of Israel didn't even come till later, really. I mean, and that is a lot more complicated. It has more to do with the Cold War between U.S. and the Soviet Union, and capitalizing on the Soviet Union's problems with Israel, because the Soviet Union began siding more with the Arab states. That's really important history to remember so that we don't have this really blind view that I know some people have, which is like Israel is somehow just a proxy of like the United States and always was. It's a very this is a very incorrect way of seeing the whole problem. It's a very complicated thing. But given the fact that Arab nationalism doesn't seem to be at all on the horizon, is it even useful for Europe to have Israel as a state exist? In that, at this point, why the two states? Why go for not just go for a one state solution? Or like a state with equal rights, basically, which has been more the position of those who are pro-Palestine advocates. I can think of the obvious reason why Israel wouldn't want that, but the reason why it's worth saying is because to what extent is even the demilitarization of Hamas at all a reasonable or realistic demand? Given that, after all that's happened in Israel's track record, I mean, it's like asking the main defense force for Palestine to just, okay, we'll end the conflict if you just give up your arms, and you have to trust us basically not to destroy you in the future and conquer more territory. It seems kind of ridiculous, and like this new army that's being proposed that is supposed to be backed by the Gulf states and the
Funded
Arab
by them,
funded.
trained by Egypt and Jordan, and perhaps politically led by European Tony Blair, is some kind of Western leadership, but
Right, it's
with
like,
Palestinians getting prepared, it's almost like a mandate.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
because
those
the
haven't
PA is
gone that
supposed to
well.
eventually be prepared to run it, but the PA has to be reformed first. There's a process that the PA has to undergo
Mhm.
before it can do this.
Right. The PA has some degree of legitimacy, even though it's quite seen as traitors by the Palestinian people
This
for
is
good
part of the
reason.
trouble. Any entity that Israel will accept as the Palestinian security
Mhm.
solution will appear to a non trivial constituency to be a puppet regime of Israel in the
Mhm.
territory.
And I mean, not without reason.
Not without reason,
No.
but of course, a regime that isn't viewed by Israel as acceptable will repeatedly get into conflict with Israel. And the Palestinians are not in a position to militarily compete with Israel.
Mhm.
So that means that there will be a lot of devastation and violence. So Israel has created a condition in which, unless the Palestinians are led by someone Israel accepts, there will be instability, no economic growth, and a lot of violence. And while the other states are willing to limit to some degree the intensity of this violence or the duration of periods of intensity of this violence, they are not willing to get rid of Israel or to prevent Israel from playing this kind of role in this territory. So this is why we're at a stage where it's a question of, well, how do you persuade Israel to withdraw? Because if you've accepted that Israel is going to exist, and all of the parties have accepted that, all of the parties participating in the negotiation have accepted that Iran is not involved. If you've accepted that Israel is going to exist, then you need somebody in Gaza that Israel can accept. But once you do that, you now have a legitimacy problem because the Palestinians living in Gaza don't accept that they should be led by somebody that Israel has a veto over.
And Israel could just attack them and conquer more territory. I mean, they want to annex
Potentially.
the West Bank, and Trump said he was against that. But if you have a pretty much controlled opposition that is unlikely to really pose a threat to Israel in response to something like the annexation of the West Bank, what would even stop that other than America wagging their finger? And like that's the big thing is Israel has shown that it has far greater plans. I mean, there there is a greater Israel ambition, and this was something that was dismissed as early as the creation of Israel, right? There was people who pointed out Israel's ambitions during the creation, but we saw, when Israel showed that they were very capable in conflicts like the 6 Day War, They were willing to expand their territory far more, and that's been in, the mindset of top Israeli officials for a long time. That far more territory, in fact, belongs to them. So when you have a demilitarized opposition, I find it hard to see that like Israel conquering more territory in the future after there's a moment for this to rest down and maybe officials are hoping people will forget about the conflict. Couldn't this just
Yeah,
allow Israel in the future just to continue swallowing more territory?
I think the main thing that can be done is that Israel can be prevented from displacing or killing the local population. And then what you get is a situation where Israel is dominating territory with substantial numbers of Palestinians still living in that territory. And then there's some possibility gradually over time of those Palestinians organizing with Arab Israelis to constitute a significant force and potentially reform the thing internally. But for that to happen, there's got to be enough social relations. Palestinians and Israelis have to interact. The fences, the walls, the things that prevent interaction have to go. Israel won't tear down or remove those things unless there's a period of peace. So, a lot of the things that you would have to do to be able to create a state that would be egalitarian with respect to religion, egalitarian with respect to Palestinians and Israelis, this would require that you first go through a period where there isn't a lot of violence and where there's a lot of social interaction. And the trouble in the region is that the Israelis have dominated the territory while preventing social interaction. The Israelis build walls. They don't allow Palestinians to work in the territory of Israel or make it very onerous for them to do so. When you do this, it makes it very hard for these Palestinians and Israelis to develop civil relationships with each other and to have a single state that would be binational or would be religiously pluralistic. That would require that there be some actual genuine ability for Israelis and Palestinians to socially mix. And there's no plausible way of developing that in a short time frame. It would take a long time. And while that's happening, there would be a prolonged period in which the Israelis would continue to treat the Palestinians as second class. And so you'd have to go through a period of serious apartheid, I think, and then social struggle within that framework
But sure,
to come out with something
which
else.
they already kind of have with the Palestinian population that does exist in Israel.
Well, with the Arab Israeli population, but I would go so far as to say that with respect to the West Bank and Gaza, Israel is not even permitted apartheid to operate because Israel
Mhm.
doesn't even permit those
Right.
Palestinians to function as second-class citizens within the Israeli territory, but instead through the use of walls and security measures incarcerates them and prevents them from socializing with Israelis, which then generates antisocial behavior in those territories,
Mhm.
which then becomes a justification for the further marginalization of those populations. So, getting this to stop and getting rid of the perceived security threat is, I think, very important. It is necessary to get Hamas out because as long as Hamas is around, there will be this perception that there's a security threat, which can then be used to prevent social relations from setting in. I think if people are expecting Hamas to win militarily against Israel at some stage, I don't see how that would happen. I don't think any of the other states in the region are
They don't
going to
even
do
think
what would
that'll
be
happen.
necessary for that to occur. So it's not going to be Hamas militarily defeating Israel. So therefore, it has to be a long, gradual process of Palestinians and Israelis finding some way of interacting, initially very flawed and very imperfect, with some possibility of gradually through social struggle improving across time.
Yeah, and Hamas does not seem like they at all even think that they could win this, in the sense that they've been showing willingness to negotiate for a while. So it's not like this kind of the propaganda often makes it out like Hamas is dead set against the elimination of Israel, and that's the only that has to happen no matter what. That they're not willing to accept anything less than Israel ceasing to exist. And it's like that's just not true at all. Like given what their willingness to negotiate, because the way the attacks are perceived is less of a result of you know, an open air prison, you know, what Gaza was turned into for a very long time. And, this is not excusing the attacks of October 7th, but seeing them as that product, right? Which that context is totally eliminated in a lot of the depictions of this conflict from the mainstream media, and that's kind of another more evidence as to Israel not really wanting to facilitate the conditions for tensions to dial down for in this, and instead encouraging those antisocial behaviors, because by having, you know what's left of Palestinian territory be as uninhabitable as possible, it really makes the very idea of Israelis and Palestinians being able to coexist unimaginable, right? And that's
Yeah, that's really the goal, to make the
yeah,
coexistence unimaginable. Hardliners want to make the possibility of coexistence sound romantic and fanciful so that nobody will take it seriously or create the conditions necessary for it to occur. And to some degree, the two-state solution reifies that, reifies the idea that there can't be any kind of social or political accommodation within a common shared framework. It takes that for granted. The difficulty is the Palestinian territory is not large enough to constitute a viable state that can defend itself from Israel. And Israel will not tolerate and will not accept, and the other states will not make Israel accept a Palestinian state that can defend itself against Israel. They will potentially create a Palestinian state that has a government that Israel accepts, that is demilitarized, and they'll call that a state and give it a flag and treat it like a state at international events. That's something that could potentially happen, but it would not be a state in a real sense, because it would not be able to defend itself against Israel. It would be an entity that, because it behaves in accordance with the wishes of the other states, is treated like a state contingent upon its behavior. And that is called a two-state solution, but it's not really two states. It's a continuation of an occupied position, but with different language so that it appears different and has a different feel to it. I don't think it's possible, with the Palestinian territories being the size that they are, for there to be a Palestinian state, if state means an entity that is able to defend itself potentially against the states in its region, in its immediate vicinity. This is not possible given the size. And also the fact that you've got, the territory is not continuous. And in the negotiations from the 90s, where there was some talk about could they make a state that would be a state that could defend itself, some proposals called for some sort of territorial connection, some sliver of territory that could potentially be ceded so that you could drive from Gaza to the West Bank. This ultimately did not occur. Even if it had been conceded, this would not have been something defensible. It would not have been something you could actually defend. So these negotiations are not really about creating a state. They're about creating something else that's called a state for propagandistic reasons. But nobody really wants to acknowledge that, in part because nobody can imagine anything more than that happening in the region. Because at this point, the idea that Palestinians and Israelis can't have civil social relations is taken for granted.
And that right there tells you what the biggest obstacles are to this, to any sort of long-term resolution to this problem. And you're, of course, coming at it from a realist geopolitical lens. The way most people, understandably deal with this is moral, because, when you see pictures of dead children all the time, it's hard not to just be like, okay, why can't we, have Israel gone tomorrow, have Hamas somehow win? It's like, what can actually happen? And what's very clear is that the biggest obstacle is the fact that most countries, not just the United States, but European countries and the Arab Gulf states, don't see it as fundamentally in their interests yet to have Israel cease to exist as a fully independent Jewish supremacist state, which is what it is now. If it was in their interest to, or at least not a hindrance to their interests, or seen as such, to have a one state, including, which would be like a, let's say, a liberal democracy that's multi-ethnic, like America, for example, right? Or South Africa, then perhaps they would allow that. But as things stand now, the dominant political parties that rule these countries don't see that is compatible with their interests. That right there tells you everything you need to know really about like what is needed to change, and that is getting like the governments to ultimately be convinced otherwise. Because until that happens, that's not going to change, and that's kind of why when it comes to pro-Palestinian advocacy, I have always preferred the frame which frames it as the backing of Israel and having a close alliance with Israel is not in the U.S. interest, as opposed to this mirror reinforcing narrative that much of the left kind of uncritically accepts, which is the idea that Israel and America are just entangled by design, either due to their settler colonial heritage or because or because Israel is somehow a proxy of US imperialism only, rather than, trying to make the case regardless, you know, there's obviously nuances and there's national kernel of truth to both angles. But rather than advocating for a sort of narrative that could in any way encourage American politicians to want to distance and break from Israel and give less support or even be more charitable to a one state. Same with, I would say, with Europe. It's more complicated in the Arab world because there's not exactly any democracy in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or Jordan. In those countries, it's really up to the elite, and factions of the elite to decide whether or not they want to change course. But for the countries that have some degree of managed democracy where can influence the government in power, I mean, I would prefer to see advocacy, and you do see that actually from a lot of the American right, ironically. A lot of the American right tends to take a position on Israel, which is framed as like America first, right? And you do see this with parts of the left, but there's also this other part of the left that I find to be very self-defeating, and I've been always very critical of because they almost mirror the kind of pro-Israel narratives in a weird way, where the pro-Israel narratives from, let's say, Ted Cruz, very good example, will say, well, America and Israel are tied Judeo-Christian values. They have the shared destiny. They're our closest ally. Then you have parts of the left who will say, America and Israel shared settler colonial past, similar destiny, and that's why the only way for Israel to cease to be a Jewish supremacist state based on apartheid and occupied Palestinian territory. Instead, it's like they think that the only way for anything to change is for like the American empire, quote unquote, to cease to exist. Some even for America to not exist, which is really the craziest fantasy. But even American empire not existing, that's like a far bigger endeavor than Israel merely transforming into a one state with, a multiracial state. We're talking about completely different scales of change. And, how we talk about this does in fact matter because the only way that anything can change is to get a sizable portion of the establishment, unfortunately, to see it, any change that one is advocating as compatible to some degree with their interests. Or else, really, the conclusion you're left with is that there's nothing can change unless you have a revolution that makes everything change. And that's sometimes the kind of nihilistic position I see leftists advocate, which,
Yeah, it's weird because on the one hand, there is a lot of moral concern, and I think very understandably so, about the fate of the people who are living in Gaza. And at the same time, claims will be made that you need to completely transform fundamentally the character of the whole world system, which is not going to happen on a time scale that's compatible with saving any substantial number of lives in Gaza or ending a humanitarian crisis that's ongoing in Gaza. When we're talking about what can you do to end a humanitarian crisis that's ongoing right now, if we approached at that moral level, it quickly becomes a political question. And that political question is, how do you get Israel to stop what it is doing as quickly as possible. What's the fastest route to doing that that doesn't have some substantial likelihood of further escalation? Now, the people who'd like to see the entire world system be transformed want there to be further escalation. They're not really interested in stopping the humanitarian crisis as quickly as possible. They're looking to see, can this in some way be used to spark the worldwide revolution? And so therefore, this becomes for them an instrument in this larger goal. And if they have a kind of third worldist view about where the revolution is meant to come from, then they think it's these struggles of liberation occurring in post-colonial contexts. That's where they would situate the spark of worldwide revolution. So then people who have that kind of view are looking to make this situation worse for the Palestinians because they think that in doing that, they might generate a larger conflict. So for many of these people, it was interesting or intriguing that the Iranians got involved through arming the Houthis to attack the ships in the Red Sea. For these people, this was a sign of it turning into a regional war, which is something they kind of wanted because they thought a regional war could potentially be generative. I don't think that's a very realistic plan. Firstly, I don't think it will lead to revolution. I don't think that kind of third worldism is likely to have the outcome that some people would like to see it have. And then secondly, I think it really conflicts with the moral argument, because the moral argument is about finding a way to stop this right now. Stopping it right now is not necessarily going to solve all the problems. So I've seen some people go, well, you shouldn't be happy about this ceasefire because it's not a plan for a lasting peace, in the sense that it's not obvious how this ceasefire will actually lead to either a two-state solution or a one-state solution. And that's true. Nevertheless, to get a stop to this violence that's currently taking place and to the humanitarian disaster that's currently taking place, if you can do that, then once you've got a condition where there isn't an active humanitarian crisis unfolding, then there's a possibility of figuring out how can we create a condition under which Palestinians are able to interact with Israelis more regularly in more areas of life so that they can see that they're not so different from each other, so that they can see that there is a possibility of at least having commercial economic relations with each other. The way to do that is to find a way to reduce the economic gap between Gaza and the West Bank, to produce stability in Gaza, stability in the West Bank, to raise the standard of living in these places. Now, if this humanitarian crisis can get the Gulf states to commit to investing in the development of Gaza and the development of the West Bank, then there's some possibility that some of these gaps might be reduced a bit. And if it is the case that they can bring in some other kind of security force that's an alternative to Hamas that can actually provide order, if it can actually do that, then the threat of violence coming from Hamas can be alleviated, and then that will make it more difficult for Israel to justify the degree to which they've securitized the region. But there are a lot of ifs and a lot of questions there. It's not something that is guaranteed to produce in any kind of neat, convenient time window a particular prefigured political result that people would like to see. We can't, if we're concerned principally about stopping the humanitarian crisis, hold the peace process hostage to a prefabricated outcome, especially when we don't have good reason to think that the prefabricated outcomes people have in mind will actually have the results that they think they will have. Creating some kind of big regional war in the Middle East is not going to produce socialism. It's not going to produce some better, more just world. It's going to create a humanitarian crisis in the places where the fighting is intense. It's going to create refugee crises. Those refugee crises will strengthen the right in Western states and in receiving countries. That's what happens when you make a big mess in the Middle East. The reason we opposed the Iraq War in the 2000s was to oppose the making of a mess in the Middle East that would create humanitarian crises, refugee crises, power vacuums, civil wars. And that is, of course, what happened in so many countries in the Middle East, in part as a consequence of the Iraq, the desert between Syria and Iraq becoming a ungoverned territory where all kinds of stuff could get going that otherwise would not have been politically viable. We ended up with the Islamic State. We ended up with enormous disturbances. Brexit itself may ultimately be linked to this, given the closeness of that vote and the proximity of the refugee crisis to that referendum. There's all sorts of consequences for making a big mess in the Middle East. And when people go, oh, we'll make a mess and it will create a revolution, it will create socialism, you know, this is very short-sighted thinking. And it's also not altogether very different from the way the Bush administration thought. The Bush administration said, we'll make a mess, but don't worry. It will eventually produce a utopian result in the future. And there were many Bush administration
Liberal
officials who
democracy.
framed, right, a domino theory, but in reverse for liberal democracy, democratic peace theory. And there were many of them who claimed when the Arab Spring revolutions began that this was the spreading of the Iraqi democratic movement to more Middle Eastern states. And it was going to make the whole region a sea of peaceful democracies. There were people who made these kinds of claims in 2011. And of course, that is not what worked out. It's not how things turned out. And I think there's just a lot of people who would like it to be the case that all of the things that they want politically just neatly go together. You can get your socialism, and you can get your end of imperialism, and you can get your end of this humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You can get all of these things all at once, all through the same course of action. But a lot of these things pull in different directions or aren't to do with each other in the way in which people would like them to be.
Well, as some individuals have more honestly put it, that they don't really even care about socialism. They want the destruction of the first world because that means the destruction of imperialism. If you have the destruction of imperialism, somehow you have the liberation of the first world. It's a position that I tend to see, ironically, usually only from people who are from the first world. It's usually people who kind of are the sort of the failed PMC types, you know, because it's like not something I actually see with a lot of people I've met who are from that region. And I have seen, like, you have seen governments in the third world who have proposed pretty bold ideas when it comes to Israel, but it doesn't involve something that it would threaten the rest of the Western countries. Like, for example, Gustavo Pedro in the latest United Nations summit proposed a UN-backed military to intervene and stop the genocide in Gaza if Israel is unwilling. Because if they're unwilling, you need to threaten them through force, and this is a way for the international community to discipline. Lula seemed to have supported the idea, and the Indonesian prime minister also proposed something along the lines of, if I recall correctly, something about floated the proposal of bringing troops even if needed, and was
Yeah,
willing to
states that are
contribute
very far away like to propose that. States
because
that
they
are
know it won't
located
happen.
very far away.
Well, it's also maybe in the case of Indonesia, I mean, they do have a big Muslim population. They just have a big population in general. To some extent, I'm sure there would be some people who would be willing to do that. The question is as to whether that's going to happen. What I'm more curious is why countries like Pakistan or Turkey aren't floating this proposal, because Pakistan and Turkey are probably some of the most capable militaries in terms of their sheer size and the willingness. Just a lot of their population hates Israel. You know, so why don't they contribute, an army that, if not could intervene to stop the genocide, at the very least could be part of this plan that could create a new army for, an independent Palestinian state that isn't Hamas.
Well, first, the Israelis would not want armies that are hostile to Israel to be performing that role. And if there's fighting, if we're talking about an army that would fight Israel, then there is a possibility of massive escalation, not least because Israel has nuclear weapons. So the states that are proximate to Israel and are more likely to face the Israeli military directly, view that kind of option as very risky and not likely to go well and likely to produce a larger disaster or set of disasters. So for them, the aim is to contain this and get it to stop quickly, rather than to look to stop it with force in a way that could have unpredictable effects. And this is something that I do think is underappreciated. This is a state that is very heavily armed. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't defeat Israel. Of course, in principle, a large enough assemblage of states could do that, but at extreme cost because of the advanced military technology and nuclear arsenal of the Israeli state. You're really talking about a state that you could not destroy without extraordinary humanitarian consequences, not just for the people living in Israel, but for people living in neighboring states who would be drawn in by the fire of it. It would turn into an enormous conflagration to actually attempt to stop Israel with military force. And it's very unpredictable exactly how bad it would be and who precisely would pay the cost of it. What would an Israeli state is being attacked on all sides and is in a process of disintegration do with its nuclear weapons? Who would it target? Which cities? Which places? These are questions no one wants to get into. And once you are dealing with a state that has nuclear weapons, this is why states try to get nuclear weapons, by the way, because it raises this set of questions. If you really go after a state that's got nuclear weapons, now you have no idea what the end game really looks like.
North Korea.
And some people have started to take this a little bit for granted because the Soviet Union broke up without nuclear use. So they've become very laid back about nuclear weapons. And in general, states are not going to use nuclear weapons offensively or flippantly. I think when people start talking about nuclear use in Ukraine, I think that's a little unreasonable. When people start speculating heavily about Russian nuclear use there, the Russian state is not in a position right now that would necessitate nuclear use because the Russian state is relatively stable and is not in a process of disintegration or collapse. But the agreement in international relations theory, the thing that almost everybody agrees on, is that in a case where a state is in a process of disintegration, there is a substantial risk that that state will engage in nuclear use to try to stave off that process of disintegration or to cause maximum damage as it disintegrates, given that its time horizon for causing further damage has become very limited. It's something that you don't want to experiment with. You don't want to push a state with nuclear weapons into that kind of situation.
Which Israel is likely to do, given that, it's kind of integral to the Zionist view. I mean, the Zionist worldview is that the state of Israel is necessary for the existence of the Jewish people, and that they need that, any sort of decline of Israeli power is a threat to the existence of the Jewish people. So it's why you get like mass support in Israel for the type of actions that you see in a way that you wouldn't necessarily for a lot of countries that are constantly involved in war and have to conscript their population. In fact, Israel is particularly a very exceptional case because it's one of the rare countries that has conscription where there's still large support for war. In a way, where most countries that have conscription, it actually seems to be correlated with less support for war. If you look at like Switzerland or the countries that had conscription laws, you have to do service for a bit. And back when America had service laws, and they stopped having it after the Vietnam War, there was a lot more opposition to the Vietnam War, in part because so much people's lives were wrapped into it, and there wasn't a clear benefit or interest in that war. Whereas when it's a non-conscripted population, it's a little easier for a lot of the population to just be apolitical and not care, right? But Israel is an exceptional case where they've really they do internalize, like, Zionism, the project of it is inseparable from Judaism. And that's really hard to break. And yeah, that's where that is an unfortunate thing. It's really hard to grapple with because if there's any state that would really go down fighting to the very last minute to really drag down the world order, if it saw, a decline to its power, it would be Israel.
And I think in particular, any state that is heavily attached to a particular national people, any state that's particularly attached to a national people and which is able to have a narrative that the world is against it and therefore against the people itself to which that state is attached. That creates a context in which the collapse of the state seems to be the end of the people. So there we're not just talking about a decline in the power of that state, but a case where there's an existential weightiness to that state. And I think it was a surprise to many people that the breakup of the Soviet Union did not involve nuclear use. It was really a shock that there wasn't a major civil war. And then since that has happened, I think there has been a very laid back, lackadaisical attitude about pressing up on nuclear states, nuclear armed states. It is a dangerous thing to do. And if you can get a different kind of resolution by a means that does not involve the possibility of that kind of escalation, it's much to be preferred. This is why the possibility of Iranian nuclear weapons is a significant issue. It is. For many states, not just the United States, it's a significant issue for Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. It's a significant issue for those states because once that happens, the ability to apply conventional pressure to Iran will be greatly limited. States will have to be very careful about creating existential danger for the regime.
And in historically in recent history, the two most, ethno-nationalist countries that come to mind were the ones who ultimately, didn't surrender to the very last moment, and that's Japan and Nazi Germany. And it's really it is very difficult when the people are in the nation are seen to be inseparable, which kind of leads me to think, if the idea of ending this conflict militarily is so unthinkable and way too risky, then, why don't we look to the South, what kind of happened in South Africa, which is that the conflict ultimately ended economically, even though there was, of course, the, resistance, the ANC's resistance against the apartheid state, which was labeled terrorism back then, by the way. It ultimately ended through the international community imposing sanctions on South Africa.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder, maybe that's where the solutions lie. And right there, you see even less willingness to do anything because, even China is ultimately very involved economically with Israel. What would it even take to impose economic sanctions? Because that seems, if that was to happen, a more realistic way of pushing Israel to move as opposed to, for military force.
Yeah, I think in practice, there would first need to be social relations established between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think as long as the Palestinians are boxed off into separate territory and not able to interact regularly with the Israelis, the apartheid language will struggle to stick in such a way that you can assemble a coalition of states for that purpose. I also think that the reason that they were able to do that with South Africa to the degree that they were had a lot to do with the Cold War and the position of South Africa in the Cold War. So as you get into the late 80s and the Soviet Union is coming apart, it is no longer necessary, or at least it no longer appears necessary, for the Western states to prop up the apartheid government in South Africa, where previously the apartheid government in South Africa was a potential instrument for the Western alliance system to militate against Soviet agitation or Soviet friendly groups in Africa. Once the Soviet Union is no longer of significant concern in the region, it's no longer necessary to sustain that kind of entity. And so in similar terms, one of the reasons that Israel is treated the way Israel is treated is that there are concerns about the other states in the region potentially becoming larger or potentially gaining a lot of weight And Israel's use as a buffer against those other states is a major part of why Israel continues to get the level of support that it gets. And there are a lot of states that have something to gain from that. Really, any state that is not a Middle Eastern state gets something out of Israel preventing a large Arab state or Turkish state or Persian state from forming. It benefits the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Americans for there to be no large Middle Eastern state that's
With
capable
with
of
Ch
negotiating on behalf of a large block of people.
with Chinese, actually, that kind of I'm not so sure about that, given that China's concern with the Middle East seemed to be the spread of radical Islam, and if anything, the Arab nationalism was a curb against radical Islam. So that doesn't seem, and even
I
with
mean,
Russia.
that case could also be made with respect to the Russians or with respect to
Mm,
the Europeans. They all have a stake in preventing the spread of radical Islam, but they have tended to care more about being able to negotiate with Middle Eastern and African states on favorable terms because those states are small, weak, don't have a lot of economic alternatives. Keeping those states balkanized economically is worth a lot to the richer countries of the world, of both Eastern and Western, you know, origin. Being a big country gives you huge advantages in negotiating. And smaller countries are at the mercy of bigger countries. They are smaller markets. They have less weight. There is less reason for investors to park their money in small markets. Why do they need to be in small markets? You have to compete harder to attract investment if you're a small market, which means you have to do more to appease people who have the ability to direct investment into your country. You have to appease capital if you want it. So keeping all of the post-colonial states small and weak is of great benefit to any larger, more powerful state and also to international capital. Capital benefits from lots of small, weak states and not one big state that can make one set of rules across a huge expanse of territory. So anytime that there's an opportunity to prevent the formation of a large state, there will tend to be significant interest both on the parts of large states and on the parts of international markets to
mm,
prevent a large state from forming. There are some large states that already exist, and there is, of course, some use in having a large state that's committed to the maintenance of the global trade system. Insofar as the United States is committed to the maintenance of the global trade system, the American Navy keeps the ports and the seaways secure around the world, and that allows an enormous amount of trade to take place. So having some large states that are nonetheless committed to the trade system is of use from the point of view of providing for security. But outside of that, there is no real interest on the part of anybody in the world who's got a lot of wealth or power in seeing new large states form in post-colonial countries. And that's why for 70 years now, post-colonial leaders of varying types with various ideologies, whether communist, socialist, Pan-African, Pan-Arab, whatever it is, have really struggled to advance their agendas and goals. Ultimately, as soon as they start to seem to get anywhere, their politics, whatever it is, will be portrayed as radical, extreme, and dangerous, and an effort will be made to check their development.
and especially one of those states that would be skeptical of a powerful new formation of a state that is a multi-ethnic state of Israelis and Palestinians would probably be Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia and also arguably maybe even Egypt, given
Saudi
that Egypt.
Arabia
Well,
is the thing about Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia benefits enormously from a divided Middle East because Saudi
mhm,
Arabia does not have a large enough population to be competitive in a straight contest between itself and Egypt, Iran, or Turkey, particularly if any one of those three were to start to get larger. So Saudi Arabia has reasons, geostrategic reasons, to be allied with Israel because they have the same ultimate goals for the region, which is to keep the region divided and to prevent a larger state from forming.
and the
And it's
big
on that basis that Jared Kushner has attempted to construct a friendly relationship between
Yes.
those two states. And they are getting somewhere with that. Indeed, before October 7th happened, they were very much poised to have a new agreement made between those states. October 7th delayed that, made it not possible in Saudi Arabia to move forward with that. But there are a lot of the smaller states, the kind of post-mandate states, states that were directly controlled by Britain or France between the two world wars. Those states have a significant stake in preventing Egypt, Turkey, or Iran from having an opportunity to get very large, very powerful, very influential.
And the big thing is also they don't want a threat to their dictatorships, because in the case of, for example, like the coup that was facilitated in Egypt that brought Sisi to power was helped facilitated by the UAE, much
Mhm.
more than it was the United States. Because let's not forget that one of the biggest threats to not just, Qatari, Emirati power, but also Saudi power is the Islamic Brotherhood the Muslim Brotherhood, and groups that are, you could say the kind of democratic and maybe even, some say socialistic leaning factions of Islam, which, have existed, and that there are, you know, factions of Muslim groups that are likely to win in popular elections if they have them. And that very much challenges the basis of dictatorial power, especially for the monarchies, because in the emergence of a multi-ethnic Arab Jewish state is as a huge threat to some extent to the power of the people who rule these dictatorial governments.
Yeah, and
I
this is why the Gulf
which
states make great mediators, because the Gulf states both, of course, have a stake in continuing to seem to be in support of the Palestinian cause because their populations want them to seem that way. But they also have a common cause with Israel in keeping and maintaining a Middle East in which very small states are viable, very small, rich states are viable and don't get absorbed by the big guys.
Mhm. Which leads me to think, if assuming there is no like popular change to overthrow these governments in the recent future, the establishment of any resolution will require their input and support to a large extent. And I wonder, you know, an independent Palestinian state, let's say the two-state solution goes through, would require, for Israelis and Palestinians to live beside each other with some sense of in two separate states, with any semblance of security, would require a functioning economy in with Palestine. And that would
Yeah,
probably require or be helped by a lot of Saudi investment. Maybe instead of the Saudis spending jillion dollars on soccer, paying however many 300 million a year for Cristiano Ronaldo, there's a lot of stuff they could do to invest in this, Palestinian state, which let's be real, be its opposition and army would probably be controlled by these states, given that the investment doesn't come without caveats. And then,
yeah.
some sense, that's still preferable to what exists now, as
Well,
much as
and
I
this
hate to
is what
admit it.
people have got to acknowledge. In the world as it exists today, the only way that there can be economic development in that region is by attracting international capital, by attracting investment. And that is going to mean that elites in some other part of the world are going to be satisfied in some way by what takes place. There isn't going to be economic development that doesn't enrich somebody somewhere. And I think a lot of people are not interested in there being economic development in the region. A lot of people want the region to be a kind of poster child for resistance to capitalism. And they think that this means no economic development or degrowth or something like that. They're not looking for some alternative socialist basis for growth, even really. At this point, a lot of people on the left are not interested in economic growth anymore, in part because they don't see a way to generate it without in some way enriching capital.
And arguably the parts of the far right too, but we'll get to that later in the back room with the anti-migrant wave. which is interesting. I'm seeing a lot of degrowth narratives from the right, actually, but phrased in different terms. But with the third worldism, there's something I want to clarify because I get attacked a lot on Twitter for being very and YouTube comments in my latest video for being very, very critical of third worldism. And part of why I'm very critical of third worldism is because I understand it extremely well. In fact, when I first had swallowed the third worldist pill, I was probably like, give or take, 12 years old, maybe even younger. I don't know. I was in the Probably younger. I was in the 5th grade when I went to Lebanon for this was the 3rd time I'd gone to Lebanon, but this is the first time I'd went to Lebanon and actually processed what I was experiencing. I was in the 5th grade, and the reality of the divisions of wealth between the first and third world were really clear to me when I went to get food at this one place, and we got food to go, and they had this little child like deliver the food. And I thought it was a little odd to have, like, a child who is younger than me at that time doing, like, what in my country, Canada, was only legally allowed usually for an adult, or at least someone who's, like, 14. So, I've been aware of the third world disparities. I think there's this idea, a lot of third worldists who get awakened to the, reality. They use it as a kind of way to, like, rather than really propose anything, they use it as a way to lecture people in their own country, almost as a kind of virtue politics or symbolic virtue signaling, frankly. Or sometimes they're
There's a
just
lot of
driven.
fetishizing of an Oriental subject, but doing it on the basis that the Oriental subject is pure. The Oriental subject doesn't have the bad traits the Westerners have.
But it's also based on a truth, is what I'm saying. Is that it's based on the truth of the disparity between the first and third world. That is very much true. Like, in that being working class in a third world country is just qualitatively not the same as being working
Yes.
class in a first world country. Like, first world country, like, in the sense of Canada, we really don't have like poor people in a significant sense. You have homeless people, but it's not a problem we can't solve. It's not like you have a large percentage of the population that is in absolute destitution and has to sell out their children to survive. And at least not yet. Maybe it'll become that way. But what I'm saying is that this sort of realization with people who don't want to also focus on what can actually be done in their own country, which they're capable of changing, often leads to sort of nihilism, where this awareness of third world disparity is used not to position a politics, but to define their politics as hate by their own hatred of their own country, in which their politics ends up being a nihilistic expression of liberal white guilt, you know?
And also
And
quitting.
left which is
Also,
or
having
leftist
given
guilt.
up on changing their own society, they then invest in third world subjects, in subjects in developing countries, in very poor countries. There's also all sorts of forms of organizing that are obviously no longer working in rich Western states, and people can project these forms of organizing onto poorer countries and suggest that because these countries are poorer, or because there's manufacturing taking place in these countries, that these forms of organizing are viable in these other places. There's part of the trouble is that people are continuously dividing the world up into West and East, rich and poor, developed, not developed, settler, indigenous. And all of these divisions obscure the degree to which everybody everywhere in the world is part of one system. One system. The Soviet Union is gone. There is no second system. All of these countries are competing for investment so that they can have enough tax revenue to have public services of any kind. They are constantly competing for jobs. They are constantly trying to keep their currencies viable. And to do these things, they have to satisfy the demands of the bond markets. They have to satisfy the demands of people who have the ability to move operations from place to place if they so choose. And this is something that people don't really want to acknowledge. They want to think in terms of different competing separate systems that operate in different areas. And of course, it's ignored, as you were saying. China trades enormously with Israel. All of these countries trade enormously with each other. Almost every country now is in the WTO. And if they're not a member of the WTO, they're an observer in the WTO, and they want to be a member. There are very, very few countries at this point, North Korea being the prominent example, that have stayed out of those international organizations. And in the case of North Korea, they're economically dependent on China. So there is no other system right now, which is deeply frustrating for people who are looking at their own country and seeing that it's hopeless and would like to believe that somebody somewhere else in the world is accomplishing something. But we are in a very difficult situation where things are not going very well anywhere, really. And insofar as things seem to be going well, they seem to be going well en route to somewhere that isn't so great. So this is something that has to be wrestled with. The third world does not exist as an escapist playground when you get exhausted with looking at a rich country and the problems of a rich country. It's not some retrograde place where things that people used to do in the 20th century or the 19th century can still occur. It's very difficult to try to solve all the problems of the world through any one case. And I think if you attach to every specific international crisis the need to solve all of capitalism in solving that crisis, for one, it turns the crisis into a huge problem of enormous scope, such that it confronts you as a totally immovable object. And secondly, it commits you to trying to accomplish things that you, from within the standpoint of your own life, with the way that your life is structured and where you live, you have no real ability to contribute meaningfully to any of that. The stuff people post online in relation to the Gaza thing, it has nothing to do ultimately with getting a solution. And the unfortunate reality of the situation is that very few people who talk about Gaza or post about Gaza are in position to accomplish much here, because the interests that have been driving the negotiations have been present from the start. It's the interests of the countries in the region, the states in the region, in preventing a refugee crisis that have been driving ultimately the push for peace. Good news, though, is that there is a real chance that we might get peace on the basis of that, and that the humanitarian crisis might come to an end without ethnic cleansing taking place. And if that happens, I think that would be a huge positive development. Not something which obviously leads to socialism or will obviously make the world as a whole dramatically better, but an enormous positive development in relation to what's been going on in Gaza for the last 2 years, and even maybe in relation to what's been going on in Gaza since the 2000s. Maybe. And even just a maybe about that, some possibility that things in Gaza might improve, that there could be an end to the blockade, even just a maybe on that. That's a significant step, even if it doesn't produce a Middle East or even an Israel-Palestine situation that lives up to what many people would like to see.
Yeah, it would certainly be a lot worse with mass displacement, everyone leaving Gaza, more refugees, more refugee crisis, which, given how poorly the Syrian one was handled and the reaction against it, that tells you everything you need to know about what could happen if another one occurred. And, we had mass refugees in Europe, which you already probably will have just from climate change alone, which makes a particular issue something that is, the left and liberals have to deal with a hell of a lot better than they deal with right now. But the far right is the single biggest reason why the far right is rising is the issue of immigration. They've been able to capitalize on it. And we have to have an honest discussion about this in a nuanced way. And we're going to do that in the back room. We're going to talk about immigration, mass migration that includes refugees, that includes legal migration, illegal immigration, all of the above. And yeah, we're going to talk about that in the back room, which you should join on Patreon if you haven't already. You know, you get a lot of episodes. The episodes in the back room aren't just the second half of the conversations. They're usually on separate topics, but with the same guest. And whenever me and Studebaker have a backroom discussion, it goes hard. People know. Baker have a backroom discussion, it goes hard. People know. Comments will tell you. So we'll see you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra